Welcome all to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Erik Rivenes. My guest this week is Paul Caranci. He, along with his wife Margie, founded the Municipal Heritage Group and was formerly on the board of directors of the Heritage Harbor Museum and the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame. He is currently on the board of the Rhode Island Publication Society. He has written 16 books, including Wired, a shocking true story of political corruption in the FBI informant who risked everything to expose it. And the book he is here to talk about today, it's all about a murder case from the 1840s called The Hanging and Redemption of John Gordon, the true story of Rhode Island's last execution. Thanks for joining me today. Great to have you.
That's my pleasure, Erik.
So is this a well-known murder case in Rhode Island?
It is, and unfortunately, it's one that I had not heard of until I went to see a play back in 2011 about it, and was astounded by what I had seen and thought for sure that the playwright had just exaggerated the facts and taken liberties to make the play more interesting. And then I found out later, after I did my own research, that not only was everything in the play 100% accurate, but it only touched on a very small part of the story, the actual trial. And there was so much more to the story. So I pitched the topic to the History Press, who had published my first book, and they said that they had heard of the case they're in South Carolina, and they had heard of the case and were anxious to get something written on it. So I did that.
Well, great that all worked out like that. So let's talk a bit about Rhode Island in the 1840s. If you wouldn't mind, tell us what life would have been like there.
Sure. Back in the 1840s and early 50s, the city of Cranston, which was a town at the time, the town of Cranston, Rhode Island, was pretty much inhabited by Englishmen that had come over, in the 1600s, shortly after immigration from England to this country. And they had been here pretty much alone for all of that time, right up until the late 1830s, early 1840s, when there started to be a slow immigration of Irish people into the state. And then by the mid-1840s, because of the famine in Ireland, a host of Irish people came over from Ireland to basically escape the famine, but even more so, the colony of Ireland at the time was under the auspices of the English government. And the English were particularly cruel to Irish people. So, not only were the Irish looking to escape the famine, but they also wanted to escape the harsh conditions that the English had imposed on them. So they started a mass immigration, and many of the Irish came here to Rhode Island and settled, in Cranston, because that's where the earlier Irish settlers had been, and particularly a place called Knightsville in Cranston. And they weren't treated that nicely here. They just, the English settlers here didn't like the Irish, and they considered them subhuman, treated them, and they talked about them as if they were pigs. They even called Knightsville, the section that they had settled in, the English called it Monkeyville, to denote the esteem for which, or the lack of esteem for which they held the Irish. So conditions weren't great. There was also some political tensions that occurred a little bit later on in mid 1840s, mid to late 1840s, and there was a very short-lived rebellion where they tried to make the legislature a little bit more representative of the people who now lived here, as opposed to all Englishmen. And they also tried to reform the Constitution to give the minorities the right to vote. At that time in Rhode Island, you could only vote if you owned at least $200 worth of land. So the Irish people that came here were mill workers. The mills were owned by the Yankees or the English, and the Irish could not vote. They couldn't really participate in government much, and they were just downcast.
Right, yeah. So amidst this tension between the Yankees and these new Irish immigrants, a man named Nicholas Gordon arrives from Ireland. And he's a go-getter, right? He's really focused on starting and growing a business. Would you talk about his arrival in the community and what he does to better his circumstances?
Nicholas Gordon, when he arrived here, I think it was 1836 that he arrived in Rhode Island. And he was ambitious, very ambitious, and a hard worker. And he wanted to be in his own business. He didn't want to work in the mills and be subject to the English rule. He wanted to do his own thing. So he worked really hard at opening up a store. He rented a little storefront in Knightsville, and he just sold convenience items, needles and threads and other notions like that. But he was quite successful. And around I think about 1837 is when he opened his shop. And then around 1840, he pretty much had learned his way around the system enough to apply for and be granted a license to sell alcohol by the bottle in his store. That was a big deal at the time because the Irish had a reputation for liking to drink, and they always supported the stores that were owned by their kind, if you will, the other Irish people. So Nicholas Gordon had a large contingent of Irish customers, and they would buy the bottle of alcohol from him. And his store was doing very well. In fact, he was granted an extension of that alcohol license again in I think 18 late 1840. I think January of 1840 is when his initial license was granted, and April of 1840 he was granted a second 3-month renewal, and then subsequently he was granted a long-term renewal of that license. So he was pretty confident that he was going to be able to sell alcohol for an extended period of time. And, it was very lucrative back in the day. So he focused on that a lot. And by 1842, he had gained enough both prominence and success as a business person and wealth that he was able to buy a piece of land for the $200, giving him now the right to vote. And he became a naturalized citizen at the time as well. And he also put a second floor on that storefront building that he was building. And the second floor had an apartment that he and later on his brother could live in. And he was doing very, very well. In fact, by late 1842, early 1843, he had saved enough money to be able to pay for the passage of his entire family to America. And that included his mother, Ellen, his brother, John, his brother, William, his brother, Robert, his sister, Margaret, and his brother, William's daughter, who speculation is that her name was also Margaret. But we haven't been able to find any formal documents indicating that. So, in any case, by 1843, he had sent for his entire family. They arrived in New York. He met them at the docks. He accompanied them to Rhode Island. And most of them got jobs in mills. Margaret became a seamstress. The other brothers were working in the mill. And John was helping William in his store. And that's about where things stood. One more important thing about the alcohol. Just before he sent for his family, he was able to convert that liquor license so that instead of selling alcohol by the bottle, he could also sell alcohol by the drink. Now, that was very lucrative because now someone could just stop into his store and have a drink. Problem was, the Yankee establishment, especially the owners of the Sprague Mill, which was located right basically across the street or down the street from the storefront, believed that Nicholas Gordon was having their mill workers stop in the store for drinks before work. And they were coming to work late. Sometimes they would come to work drunk. They started to reduce productivity at the mill because of the condition of the workers. And the work-related accidents began to increase. And that was a real problem for the Spragues who owned the mill. And it became a real problem for the Gordons, who it was believed was selling the alcohol to the mill workers. They denied that. They said that it was someone named Job Wilbur, who also owned a store not far from Gordon's store, that was selling the alcohol to the mill workers, but he was doing it illegally. He didn't have a license to sell alcohol by the drink. So, the Gordons alleged that the Irish mill workers were going there to drink, not in his store.
Right. So the Sprague family, there's one member in particular, Amasa Sprague, that Nicholas will ultimately exchange some words with, words that will come back to haunt him later.
The Sprague family was extremely powerful. They moved to Rhode Island in 1710. So they had a presence in the state for that long. They owned several mills. The Sprague Mill in Cranston, Rhode Island was just one of about 6 mills that they owned. They were a politically powerful family. Family members, including Amasa, were on the town council. Other members of the family were served as governor, as United States senator. I mean, they were, and several of them were in the legislature. So they were extraordinarily powerful politically. They were powerful financially because of their extraordinary wealth. And they pretty much controlled everything that went on in politics and in society in Cranston, Rhode Island, other places as well. But what happened shortly after Nicholas sent for his family is that the Sprague family made a move on his liquor license, on Nicholas's liquor license, because they believed that he was selling the drinks to the mill workers who were coming to work late and drunk. They decided to pull his liquor license. Now, when they did that, his profits were immediately going to drop. He was clearly upset, and he believed that he wasn't the problem, that this guy, Job Wilbur, was the one actually selling the alcohol. So he was upset. And in the heat of the moment, when they pulled the liquor license, he threatened Amasa Sprague, saying, you're going to pay for this. And it was more of an innocuous, he was upset and he blurted it out and he left the meeting. Didn't come to blows. There was no fighting. There was no problem. And some time went by. But Nicholas knew that he had a financial problem now because he had just sent for his entire family. They were now here. And back then, there was no welfare. There was no government programs or subsidies that you could apply for if you were out of work or if you lost money. He knew that he was financially responsible for his family because they weren't yet citizens. And when you brought family here, you had to pledge your responsibility for them financially and otherwise. So he knew he couldn't do that. He couldn't be financially responsible for an entire family with the drop in income that he was going to experience by losing his liquor license. So he was really upset and he was worried and he was panic stricken. And that's kind of what happened all leading up to the day about maybe 5 or 6 months later when Amasa was found dead.
Right. So it was a very joyful reunion when his mother, his siblings finally arrive, and he lets them live with him for a bit. This is the summer of 1843. His family members begin looking for work, finding places to live, establishing themselves into the community. And it's this nice, hopeful period for the family. But around Christmas, that's when the drama really begins. John does some odd things which will later cast suspicion on him.
Well, yeah, John would drink heavily. John was oftentimes found drunk, staggering drunk, and sometimes passed out, in the side of the roads. So he had a reputation of, not being the most, Christian of people. He was also rather big. He was tall, but he was thin, and really in a fight, he probably wouldn't have been one to be able to handle himself very well. Nicholas, on the other hand, was a lot stronger and bigger, and he could really take care of himself. I guess I failed to mention that, and this becomes important later on, that for protection and also for hunting purposes, Nicholas purchased both a rifle and a handgun, and he had both of those things in his store behind the counter, so that if anything, if anybody tried to hold up the store or anything like that, he could protect himself. And John knew where those guns were. They were always right behind the counter. So that becomes important because on December 31st, Amasa Sprague, who had just celebrated with his wife, it was his wife Fanny's 45th birthday that day, and they were having dinner, or supposed to have had dinner at the mansion as a family. But it was a very cold day. It looked like it was going to be a freezing night. So Amasa went out, left the mansion, despite the fact that they were expecting a lot of company for New Year's Eve. And he went first to check on the furnaces in his mill, which he could do without leaving the house because they had an underground tunnel that went from the house to the mill, which was right across the street from the mansion. And then he left the mill to go check on his livestock, which were just across the Pecasset River into the town of Johnston, Rhode Island. And he had, I guess, several animals there that were kept outside, and he wanted to make sure that they were put inside for the night. So as he was doing that, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when he reached a little, they called it the string bridge. It was a little footpath that went over the Pecasset River, which was a very narrow part of the river, into Johnston. And just as he did, he noticed from the corner of his eye a man heading in his direction and pulling a gun from his coat.
So John is spotted out with a rifle. He says he's hunting.
Yeah, around the same time that Sprague was murdered, he was off hunting, but he wasn't in that same area. And although there's no hard evidence to that, there was testimony to that effect during the trial. It's hard to prove a negative, so it's hard to prove he wasn't somewhere. It's easier to prove where he was, and all the witnesses said he wasn't there. In fact, many witnesses had him attending a christening in Providence, Rhode Island, at the time, which is probably a good 30-minute walk from where the murder happened. But in any case, Amasa Sprague crossed the string bridge over the Pecasset River, and he crossed into Johnson, and he noticed from the corner of his eye a man approaching him from his left side. And as the man came closer, Sprague saw that he pulled a gun from his coat and pointed it at his head. So Sprague, who was quite a big man, raised his arm kind of in a defensive posture, holding it up in front of his face. But just as he did that, he could feel the lead ball pierce his right forearm, about at the knuckle of the wrist. And that was simultaneous to him hearing the gun blast. It was a handgun. And the lead ball actually drilled like a 4-inch path right through Sprague's forearm and stopped just before exiting at the wrist. He was, obviously in a lot of pain, and instinctively he would, reach for his right arm with his still good left hand. And as he did that, he turned back toward the Cranston side of the bridge. He was going to go back across the bridge and head home. But he was kind of staggering toward the bridge, trying to get away from his assailant. And when he did that, he felt a crushing blow on the back of his head, and then a second whack. And the first one knocked the hat off his head. And it was so hard that it opened up two parallel gashes right across the back of his head, each one measuring about an inch in length. The second one created a 3-inch wound that started from the point of the first gash and extended all the way back to the ear. So now he's in a lot of pain, not just his arm, but his head, and he's bleeding profusely. I'm sure the blood was dripping into his eyes, making it hard for him to even see. But Sprague was was a very big man. He was about almost 200 pounds. He was 6 feet. He was very athletic, and he was pretty determined to fight off this assailant. But the assailant was a combination of the strength of the assailant, which is another reason why it's pretty clear it wasn't John Gordon, who was not that strong a person, but the strength of the assailant, and coupled with the fact that Sprague was now pretty injured and probably dizzy from the blows to the head, that it almost seemed like an unmatched battle. So the gunman reached for Sprague's face, grabbed him by the chin, slammed the gun again against his face, and it split the side of his face wide open, even spilling some brain matter out onto the snow. There was a layer of snow on the ground. So he was pretty out of it at this point, Sprague was, and probably lost consciousness at that point. And he collapsed just short of reaching that string bridge. So he actually collapsed on the Johnston side of the bridge, not the Cranston side where he called home. But the attacker still wasn't done. It was just a brutal murder. And sensing that Sprague might still be alive, he raised his arm again and slammed the gun down on Sprague's face so hard that he broke his face bones, his cheekbones, and his jawbone, and broke the gun. The gun broke into several pieces, and it was just left there at the scene. And Sprague was left lying face down in the snow, and that's where he died. About maybe a couple of hours later, one of Sprague's employees was walking home, one of his servants, and he found the body right across on the Johnson side of the bridge. And he called the Johnston police, and the coroner came. He didn't even recognize Sprague as his boss. That's how broken up Sprague's face was. So it was the body was then taken to not the morgue, but the coroner's office in Johnston, and he was pronounced dead there.
Yeah, whoever did this, it was pretty obviously personal.
Oh, absolutely personal. But again, it had to be a big guy, and Gordon doesn't fit that bill. It had to be a very strong guy, and Gordon doesn't fit that bill. John Gordon doesn't fit that bill. So, the evidence in the beating alone would provide some reason to doubt that John Gordon was involved or was the gunman.
But because of that exchange, that confrontation that Nicholas Gordon had months earlier with Sprague, that's where everyone's minds went, right? Exactly. Gordon had the grudge, so he must have done it.
But it was one that took off because of that bigoted hatred against the Irish at the time by the Englishmen. So it was really that prejudice and that bigotry that drove everybody to blame this new Irish family that came into town. So the very next day, the newspaper, the predominant newspaper of the state, is the Providence Journal, And that paper, which was owned by a mill owner, started to run articles implicating the Gordon family. So that the next day, on January 1st, John and Nicholas Gordon were both arrested. The very next day, on January 2nd, the rest of the family was arrested. The mother, Ellen, the brother, William, and the brother, Robert. A family friend by the name of Mike O'Brien was also arrested. And believe it or not, they actually arrested the dog, the family dog,
Yeah.
because they found dog prints in the snow near where the body was found. And they thought by confiscating the dog or arresting the dog, they could match the dog prints with those that, were in the snow, which is absurd because, how do you match a dog print? But that's how intent they were on getting the Gordon family. But it got worse because during the search for evidence, they actually only followed the evidence that led them back to the Gordons. If evidence led in some other direction, that evidence was destroyed. For example, footprints were followed. Now, this was the most common path. Obviously, it was the only little bridge to get across the Pocasset River. So everybody who went across the river from Johnston to Providence to Cranston, they had to cross in that direction. They went across the same path. So, there were footprints coming from every direction in that area. But they followed only the footprints that went from the area to the Gordon house or by the Gordon house. And they measured those footprints very carefully. All the other footprints, they just, destroyed. They just walked across them or erased them from the snow. So it was clear that they were just trying to get the Gordons and make sure that, there was enough evidence against them. Now, back in the day, there were only like 3 size boots, men's boots. There was only one style of boot that was sold, and it came in 3 sizes. It's not like today where you have size 11, 12, 13, 13 and a half, 11 and a half. It was 3 sizes, and you got the one closest to your foot size, and that's what you wore. So the boot that John Gordon wore was the most common size, and at least 1/3 of the male population had that boot, that exact boot, that lived in that area. Yet they thought the footprints measured a certain width and a certain length, therefore it was John Gordon's boot. So the evidence that they found was nothing more than circumstantial, and it was directed to indict or convict the Gordons. The Journal, the Providence Journal, didn't make it any easier. They wrote stories implicating the Gordon family even before any evidence was found. For example, they wrote a story in the Providence Journal saying that the gun that was found in pieces from the beating of Amasa's face at the scene of the crime where the body was, that gun belonged to Nicholas. And they said that because when searchers went in the store, when they arrested John and Nicholas, they didn't see the gun. They failed to notice that the guns were behind the counter. So they assumed that his gun was the one found at the scene of the crime. And, evidence like that, it was just fabricated, made up. It wasn't based on anything other than circumstantial evidence. But it was good enough. Even the dog, by the way.
Right.
Is it okay if I read a little part from the book?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Because it was fascinating to me. This is how the Providence Journal wrote the story of the Gordon's dog. Now, the Gordon family dog was described by those who knew it as a good old dog, as feeble and harmless a mutt that there could be. The Gordons had not known him to ever hurt a single living thing. The dog could barely walk and didn't have a tooth left in its head. Yet the description of the dog that appeared in the Providence Journal the next day would have left you wondering if they were describing the same animal. This is the quote now from the journal. Regarding the arrest of the Gordon's family dog, a journal reporter wrote, quote, "Close to the tracks of a man found leading to the swamp were tracks of a dog. Nicholas Gordon owns a ferocious dog. which was found in his shop by Officer Shaw, who forced the door. The dog wears a collar of jagged metal, and some of the wounds upon Mr. Sprague are such as would be made by such a collar on a dog springing at his throat. Now, there's no way that description described a dog that could barely walk, didn't have any teeth in its head.
Right.
But that was an attempt by the journal to sway public opinion against the Gordons. They didn't have to try very hard because, again, the Gordons were Irish and they weren't liked by the establishment. But that was just an example of how they just, pointed toward the Gordon family and did everything in their power to set them up to take the fall on this murder.
Listeners, I'm sure, will be happy to know that even though the dog was arrested and held overnight, he was released from custody the next day.
He was released unharmed, yes.
So the dog got lucky, but certainly not the family.
Right.
So there are a couple of things that I want to ask you about in relation to the crime scene. You mentioned the footprints, the disassembled gun that was found, and there was also a coat, a jacket, a coat, and
yes.
Also John Gordon showed up to Mass with a bruised face and torn pants later on, right?
Yes. And those are things that happened, I guess, during the hunting process. So it had nothing to do with a murder of Amasa. And there was no, to anybody's knowledge, there was no fighting with Amasa Sprague. Amasa was shot in the arm, and then he was hit in the back of the head twice. He was on the ground when the other blows to his face happened. There wasn't a struggle. There wasn't a fight that would have left bruise marks on the assailant. So it's hard to believe that those might have been related to any kind of skirmish with Amasa that they tried to allege. The coat is a really interesting point. The coat had what they said was blood on it, but later it was found to be red madder, which was a dye that they used in the milling process. So that would indicate that the coat was probably owned and worn by someone who worked at the mill, and they got that red dye on it. And it could be that the coat was basically ruined at that point, and that's why it was just discarded. Or it could be that it was left at the scene by the assailant. There's no hard evidence that it belonged to the assailant. But what is clear is that when John Gordon tried that coat on, it basically wrapped around him. In other words, John Gordon was a tall, thin man. Whoever owned this coat was a very robust person, maybe bordering on fat. And, the coat was far too big for John Gordon and just kind of wrapped around him. So, it was hard to believe that coat belonged to John Gordon. But there was a witness at the trial who said she had seen John Gordon wearing that coat before. But at the trial, as we'll get into this in a bit, I guess, at the trial, witnesses lied, perjured themselves, and their stories were inconsistent, one from the other. So, it's easier to believe that someone made up the story about seeing John Gordon wearing that coat than it is to believe it was his coat.
Yeah. One of the things, too, that ultimately, in hindsight, was a major mistake for William Gordon. It's when he made the bad decision about his brother's weapons, Nicholas's weapons.
Yes. It's easy to understand why, but it was later discovered that William had hidden the two guns, the rifle and the handgun, owned by Nicholas after the arrest of John and Nicholas. And the reason he did that is because back in Ireland, if you were accused by the British government of murder and you were found to own a gun, that pretty much sealed your fate. The gun ownership was almost equivalent to a guilty verdict in Ireland. And again, it was because the English weren't too fond of the Irish and they didn't treat them the same way they would have if it was an English person being tried. So William knew that. And when he went to the store after the arrest of John and Nicholas and found that there were two guns behind the counter, he went and hid them upstairs on the second floor apartment. He moved a rug, lifted up a couple of loose floorboards, put the guns in the floor, so they were now between the ceiling of the first floor and the floor of the second floor. And then he replaced the floorboards and replaced the carpet. And in doing that, he pretty much assured no one was going to find those guns. We thought he was doing John and Nicholas a favor, but in reality, he probably caused the guilty verdict of John. And can get into that in a bit right after the trial information if you want.
Sure, sure. So William is eventually arrested too, and then all three men face trial. But one good bit of news in all of this for the family is that Nicholas has money, so he's able to hire some good attorneys.
Yes. And because he was charged with a different crime, John and William were charged with the murder of Amasa Sprague. Nicholas was charged with being an accessory before the fact. They believe that Nicholas hired his two brothers, or asked his two brothers, to go kill Amasa on his behalf. So his charge was different. So his trial was separate, and he did have good attorneys. Although I have to say that John and William also had good attorneys, and the guilty verdict of John was not because of any kind of incompetence on behalf of the attorneys. It was more because of the lies, the perjury of witnesses, and the fabrication of evidence, and William's hiding of the guns. So those are the things I think that led to the guilty verdict more than any kind of problem with the attorney.
And the bias created by the newspapers as well, of course.
Yes.
Can you talk about their alibis? Because it's strange that William was even arrested, right? Tried. I mean, he had a solid alibi the night of the murder.
He did. He was both at the christening with John, and then he left the christening early. Christening, for those who might not be Christian or Catholic, is the when a person of Christian faith is confirmed, and they're either baptized or confirmed, and it's called a christening. And it happens at various times in a person's life, but usually when they're very young. Today, we christen someone basically right after birth. But back then, a person could have been in their teens before they were christened. So it was kind of subjective. But in any case, he was at a christening, a family christening, or a friend's christening of a friend's child. And the whole family was there. In fact, William was a pretty fun guy to be around, and he was actually leading the whole group in song. But they were all sitting at the same table. His mother, Ellen, was sick that day, and she was unable to go. And William left the christening a little early and walked to his mother's house right around the time of the murder. And he wanted to just check in on his mother. But along the way, he was met by an English person who, had a pretty good reputation in the community. And that person testified that William couldn't have been at the scene of the crime because he was actually talking to him at the time the crime was committed. So it essentially, cleared the testimony of that English witness, cleared William. Because as we'll see later, the judge at the trial instructed the jury to put more emphasis on the testimony of Englishmen and less weight on the testimony of Irishmen, which, you try that today in a courtroom and the whole trial would be overturned because of the judge's instructions to the jury. But back then, he got away with it. In a clearly biased and prejudiced society, nobody cared that he said that, except maybe the Irish people. But none of them could serve on a jury because they just couldn't. The jury was all Englishmen. And it was all men, by the way. There were no women on the jury either. So it was all English men. And, they didn't object at all to being instructed that way by the judge. But, that testimony of the English witness cleared William completely. John stayed at the christening, so he didn't have the luxury of having an English person testify on his behalf. As a matter of fact, there were two English witnesses that were on their way to have tea with the father of one of the two, who passed by, very close to the scene of the crime, and testified that they saw John and William both walking. In the first instance, they were walking toward the scene of the crime in the opposite direction, and then they were seen again coming back. So they actually passed by them so closely that they had to move over because there wasn't enough room to walk side by side. You had to walk single file. So they had to move over to allow who they said were the Gordons to pass by. But clearly it wasn't John and William, because William was talking to an English person some distance from the crime scene. So it wasn't William, but they were still convinced that it was John. And they said one of them carried a gun when they were going toward the crime scene, and had a coat on, but didn't have the coat when they were returning, implying that the coat found at the scene belonged to John Gordon. So, again, fabricated evidence. It could not have been John and William, because John and William were at the christening, and William had the perfect alibi. So it could not have been them, but they identified the two suspects as the people they saw, and they swore to it. And because the judge said, put more reliance on the weight of the evidence of the Englishman, that's what the jury did. So it didn't take them too long at the end of this. Oh, there was even a prostitute that testified. This is pretty funny. And she said that she shopped in Nicholas's store several times over the course of the past few months, and she clearly could identify the Gordons and say who they were. And when the defense attorney asked them to identify the two Gordons, she identified John as William and William as John. She couldn't even identify the two that were sitting in front of her at the trial. So clearly her testimony was made up and fabricated. But, again, she was British, so her testimony carried more weight. But all of the evidence submitted was circumstantial. And even the gun, there was no evidence that the gun belonged to Nicholas, other than that they said they couldn't find Nicholas's gun. So they just ascribed the gun to him. But clearly it wasn't his gun, because later on his guns were produced when William finally found the courage to tell his story. But at the trial, the judge told the jury that circumstantial evidence was even more conclusive than eyewitness testimony, because that police car going by, because that testimony had to be corroborated by more than one person. So circumstantial evidence was deemed better than eyewitness testimony, only in the Gordon trial, I guess. But after all the evidence was gathered and the three members were tried, it was only John that was found guilty. William was found not guilty. And again, largely on the strength of the testimony of the Englishman that was talking to him at the time of the murder. And as John was pronounced guilty, he looked at William and said, "It is you, William, who have hung me." And nobody really knew what he was talking about at the time. William did, because just prior to the trial, William and John, even though they were incarcerated at the same prison, hadn't seen each other until the trial. And William never had a chance to tell John that he had hidden the guns. But he did that just before the trial started. So John was one of only two people, William being the other, that knew that Nicholas's guns were hidden. And if Nicholas's handgun was hidden, then the handgun found at the scene could not have belonged to Nicholas. And if the handgun at the scene wasn't Nicholas's gun, then Nicholas and his brothers didn't commit the murder. with that gun. But nobody knew that until John said, "It is you, William, who have hung me." And clearly he was talking about that fact, but no one else knew that. The attorneys later found out after John was found guilty, and they were talking to William, and they asked what John might have meant by that. And William, finally got the courage to tell them that he had hidden the guns. Now, why didn't he say that sooner, if that evidence could have exonerated his brother? Well, clearly, William knew he hadn't committed the murder, so he didn't feel he had anything to worry about in terms of being convicted for the murder of Amasa Sprague. But if he admitted that he hid the guns, he could have easily been charged with obstruction of justice, with concealing the evidence, with lying to the police, with all kinds of other crimes that he would have been guilty of. So in an effort to save his own skin and not give the police new charges to bring against him, he just kept quiet about hiding the guns until it led to the conviction of his brother. Then he was convinced by some friends that he better go to the authorities and let them know. And he did that. And when he did that, the police went to the house and they found the guns exactly where he said he put them, under the floorboards on the second floor. And now they had the evidence, that largest piece of evidence against John, the gun, was no longer in evidence, or could no longer be in evidence against him. So they asked for a new trial. But the court put off a decision until the fall session of the court. That was in October. In October, his motion for a new trial was denied, and he was ultimately sentenced to death by hanging, and that was to take place on Valentine's Day, February 14th of 1845.
So did that new information, when William finally admitted what he had done with the guns, did that affect the outcome of Nicholas's trial? Because Nicholas was tried after John and William.
Yeah, it very well may have, but the first trial of Nicholas, which was, I think, a week after the trial of John, ended in a hung jury. And then the state said they were going to try him again, and they did. But the second trial also ended in a hung jury. So I suspect that evidence was, obviously presented at Nicholas's second trial at least, and may have contributed to the jury being deadlocked. But I don't know for sure, because I didn't delve too deeply into the trial of Nicholas.
So you would think that the Sprague family, one of the leading prominent families in the area, would want to get to the bottom of this murder. And there had to have been a little bit of doubt by family members, right? That maybe these weren't the right guys. I mean, the evidence was not strong. Do you think they were just so hyper-focused on the Gordons because of the feud? Or could they have been covering for someone? Did someone within the family have it out for him? What are your feelings about the murder?
I believe that I don't think that they had it out for the Gordon family. I really don't think other than Amasa Sprague, I don't think the other family members really knew the Gordons that well. And Amasa couldn't say anything after his death. So I'm not sure it was anything they specifically had against the Gordons. But they did hate the Irish. There's no question about that. And the Gordon family fit the bill. They were Irish. And the evidence that was presented, only the evidence that was presented both in the newspapers and at trial, pointed to the Gordons. They didn't look for anybody else. So I think that the Sprague family may have actually believed, based on the evidence, that the Gordons were guilty. But there is another theory, and it's not mine. I don't buy into it. But there was a book called Brotherly Love. It was written by Charles and Tess Hoffman. They were both professors, one at Rhode Island College and the other at the University of Rhode Island. And they wrote this book, back in the early 90s, 1993, I think. And in the book, they allege that it was actually William Sprague, the senator, U.S. senator, that had his brother killed. Now, the reason that they allege that is because there was a couple of things going on. First, there was always dissension between Amasa and William. Their father wanted William to go into a life of politics, which he did. He was governor. He was U.S. senator. He was councilman before that. He was in the legislature. So he followed a career path into government. And he wanted Amasa to run the mill. And Amasa did. He ran all the mills while his brother was in Washington serving as a senator. But they speculate that William Sprague was actually jealous of Amasa, that he wanted to run the mills, and that Amasa didn't have enough business acumen to know how to expand their empire. So William Sprague wanted to expand. He wanted to buy more mills. The times were pretty good back in the mid-1840s for the Spragues. So he wanted to use their money and buy more mills. Amasa was a little more conservative and said, no, times aren't always going to be this good, and we have to have something put away for a rainy day. So I don't want to invest in more mills. I want to hold on to some of our money and keep it liquid. Well, they argued about that. But Amasa would always say, hey, Dad wanted me to run the business. He wanted you to be the politician. So you do your thing in Washington. Let me take care of this. And there was that little rivalry there. So speculation is on the part of the Hoffmans that William Sprague had his brother killed so he could then take over the empire and leave politics, which he really didn't enjoy that much. In fact, right after the murder, he did resign his Senate seat and announced that he was going to lead the investigation, not the police. He was going to lead the investigation into his brother's murder. Now, was that to make sure that they covered up the fact that he was responsible for the murder and make sure that some Irish family took the fall? That's what the Hoffmans speculate. As a matter of fact, right after the death of Amasa, William did take over the mills. He resigned his position politically. He took over the overseeing of the mills, and he did expand, and he did buy other mills. And just as Amasa had forewarned, times did turn, and the Spragues ended up filing bankruptcy and losing everything. So, there might be some reason to put some stock into their theory. I just don't buy it. And I would say if you're going to look for another perpetrator, there's one right in plain view. His name was Big Pete, Peter Dolan. And he worked for Amasa Sprague at the mill. Didn't get along with Amasa Sprague at all. And he was fired just before Christmas in 1843. And just after Christmas is when Amasa was found dead. The coat that was found near the scene of the crime had that red matter on it, which they determined was red matter from the mill. So whoever owned the coat worked at the mill, more than likely. And Big Pete, Peter Dolan, was a very large guy, one that would fit into that coat, as opposed to John Gordon, who, the coat wrapped around him almost twice. So if you're going to look for a perpetrator, I think that's a better place to look than to the guilt of Amasa Sprague's brother, William. All the evidence has long since been destroyed, so you can't go back now and try to pin it on anybody. It's too bad, too, because the advent of DNA evidence, maybe you could have gone back and got some blood and found out it belonged to anybody else, but you can't do that now. And by the way, Peter Dolan disappeared right after the murder, the next day, and no one had heard from him again until he was traced to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where it's said, there's no hard evidence of this, but the legend is that on his deathbed, he confessed to the murder.
Interesting.
That's an Irish legend, so I don't know if there's any truth to it or not. But confession aside, the coat certainly would have fit him, and he had as much reason, if not more reason, to go after Amasa than William did. And why did William, if it was William Gordon, Nicholas Gordon, why did he wait almost 6 months to murder him? Why didn't he do it sooner? Whereas the Dolan possibility, he was fired just before Christmas. The murder was right after Christmas. He didn't wait that long at all if it was him. So it makes more sense than I think the Sprague theory, but we'll never know.
Right, right. And also, he wasn't robbed either,
No,
right? That wasn't the motive.
he was not robbed. No, it was clearly it was either a vengeful act by someone that wanted to get even with him, or it was a random act by some thug who came across him. But robbery certainly wasn't a motive. I mean, there are other people too. That there was an apartment or a boarding house right across from Sprague's farm, or where he kept his livestock, on the Johnston side of the Pecasset River. And that boarding house was owned by a woman and her husband. And it's said that that woman and Amasa Sprague were having an affair. Now, if that's the case, then maybe his wife Fanny found out about the affair and she had him killed. Or maybe the husband of the woman who, the people that owned the boarding house, maybe he found out about the affair and he had Amasa killed. I mean, so there's other people who had grudges, potentially, had grudges against the Spragues. If that story about the affair is even true. I mean, I didn't really find any evidence to support that other than rumors that were passed around at the time. So if it is true, that even opens up the door further to other people. But the bottom line is we just won't know. And it's interesting to note that the trial of John and William Gordon was so corrupt that 7 years later, in 1852, the Rhode Island legislature, abolished the death penalty in Rhode Island for all crimes. Back then, you could receive the death penalty for stealing a horse, too. So Rhode Island abolished the death penalty for all crimes. There was another state that had abolished the death penalty for capital crimes, like murder. But Rhode Island was the first state in the nation to abolish it for all crimes. And it was because of the injustice that was perceived at the trial that caused them to do that. And roughly 70 years later, in 2011, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a resolution supporting the pardon of John Gordon, and Governor Chafee did pardon him. So Gordon now lies an innocent man. It really didn't do much for John Gordon, but it did clear the family name. But what it also did, one of those unintended consequences of an action, it made this a cold case again, because the person that was found guilty of the crime was pardoned of the crime. So it's a cold case, and because of the age, it has become Rhode Island's oldest cold case. And because all of the evidence has been destroyed, it will never be resolved, so it will always remain Rhode Island's oldest cold case.
Wow, huh. There is a moment not long before John is executed when he is able to see William again. And they are able, right, to move past their old issues.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, if you don't mind me reading a section again, it's a very poignant scene, and
Sure.
it leads to another point of John that may prove John's innocence. So that goes like this. Despite the overwhelming lack of evidence of his guilt, John Gordon was out of options. More importantly, he was out of time. He didn't spend his last 3 days on earth lamenting the decisions by the court, the General Assembly, or the governor, nor did he curse his detractors. Rather, he pragmatically approached his own demise. He expressed his forgiveness of William, who visited John every day until the last. At about 10 o'clock in the morning of February 14, 1845, prison guards escorted John's brother William and Father John Brady, the parish priest, from the Church of Saints Peter and Paul into John's cell. John was pale and haggard, the result of months of anguish and incarceration with felons. The three men talked and prayed in John's cell for about an hour, what surely seemed the quickest hour since his incarceration so many months ago. At 11 o'clock, the sheriff entered the cell, and appearing visually affected, adjusted John's white robe and cap. As they took what would be John's final walk, he was calm and composed as if nothing was about to transpire. In the corridor, John met his brother Nicholas, whom he had not seen for almost a year, though incarcerated in the same prison. The two embraced in a long farewell, at which time John urged Nicholas to take courage and not be downhearted. That's an amazing fact. John, who was just 29 years old, urged his older brother Nicholas to take courage and not be downhearted. This guy's about to die for something he didn't do, and he still has the frame of mind to say that to his brother. They soon parted company, and John left the confines of the cold, damp, and impersonal prison walls for the last time. As he walked through the steel door and into the biting, wintry chill of the prison yard, he gazed at those assembled to witness his demise. The sheriff and Father Brady accompanied John up the stairs of the scaffold that had been constructed in the prison yard. Here, in plain view of the 60 witnesses allowed to attend the execution, the prisoner was expected to confess his guilt. It was customary in such settings for the guilty man to ask, no, to beg, the forgiveness of God and his fellow man. But today's events would not follow the customary script. Neither did Father Brady's final words to the condemned man follow the expected ritual of platitudinous spiritual solace for a remorseful or guilty criminal. Father Brady said simply, "Have courage, John. You are about to appear before a just and merciful judge. You are going to join the myriads of your countrymen who, like you, were sacrificed at the shrine of bigotry and prejudice. Forgive your enemies." Gordon looked longingly at his priest and responded, "I do. I forgive all my enemies and persecutors. I forgive them, for they know not what they do." He looked to the crowd assembled and said, "I hope all good Christians will pray for me." Then Gordon faced the sheriff and with a nod of his head said, "Yes, I'm ready." A handkerchief that was given to John by his mother was used to cover his eyes. It was tied around his head and the noose fixed tightly upon his neck. As he stepped onto the trapdoor, he seemed to falter. Within seconds, anti-gallows Judge William Staples pulled the lever, releasing the platform from beneath John's feet. The fall and sudden stop as the rope reached its limit snapped John's neck. His body jerked from side to side as the last vestige of life left his dangling body. Death was almost instantaneous, yet as if in retribution for his perceived lack of remorse and his failure to admit guilt, John's body was left hanging in the gallows for 20 minutes. When finally removed from beneath the scaffold, John's limp body was placed in a coffin that was simply inscribed, "John Gordon, aged 29 years." Now that's the death of John Gordon, but what's really telling in that scene is the fact that he gave his confession just before his execution. Now, in the Catholic faith, when you commit a sin, a mortal sin, they're called, something like murder, you're going to go to hell if you don't confess that sin to a priest. Catholics believe that deeply. So you have to confess a mortal sin to a priest. So he did. He had his confession before he died when he was in his jail cell with his priest. Yet, his priest makes the statement, "Have courage, John. You are going to appear before a just and merciful judge. You are going to join the myriads of your countrymen who, like you, were sacrificed at the shrine of bigotry and prejudice. Forgive your enemies." He didn't say, "I know you did this, John. You told me you did this, and God forgives you." He said, you're being sacrificed at the shrine of bigotry and prejudice, which means John didn't confess to the murder with his priest, assuring that he would go to hell according to his faith.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah. And he was quite religious as well. The whole
Very
family
religious.
was.
So that's very hard evidence that he did not commit the crime. I mean, it's very personal evidence, And maybe non-Catholics wouldn't basically see it that way because they may not understand the importance of confession in his faith. But clearly he did, and he didn't confess it. So that's a very strong, it leads to a very strong possibility that he did not commit the murder.
Goodness. Wow. Well, I so appreciate you sharing these details of this case with us and going so in depth with it. And you have a website for people who want to learn more.
Yes.
So what is the most critically acclaimed book, would you say, of the books that you've written?
Well, this book was named by the Providence Journal, of all things, one of the top 5 nonfiction books of 2013.
A belated congratulations.
Yeah, it remains one of my favorites. But I have another true crime story that I really love, and that's called Terror in Wichita, which is also coming out in podcast form soon. But all of my books, I say my absolute favorite is my most recent book, and it's called History's Greatest Mystery, and it's about the convergence of the images of Christ on 4 different 3 cloths in a painting. And the convergence is so compelling that in a court of law in Rhode Island, for example, if you want to convict, well, actually anywhere in America, if you want to convict somebody of a crime based on photographic evidence, you need 8 points of convergence, a minimum of 8 points of convergence in that photograph with the image of the actual person. In the 3 images of Christ on the shroud, the Sudarium of Oviedo, and the Veil of Veronica, and the painting of Divine Mercy, those 4 images, when you overlap them, have 90 points of convergence. That's astounding. And it proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Christ. So that book is my most recent and has become my new favorite. But all of my books can be found on my website, www.paulcaranci.com. And they're all available on Amazon.com, and they're all in bookstores.
And people can look out for your podcast, Terror in Wichita.
Yes.
Do you know offhand when it's scheduled for release?
Yep, just a few days from now. It's coming out on the 14th of December, and that is going to be on every major platform where podcasts are heard, Spotify, YouTube, you name it. And that's going to be in 7 parts, and each week will be a new part.
And it's about more recent events, right?
Yes, that crime took place in the year 2000 in Wichita, Kansas. It's a brutal story of murder and rape and abuse, and it's just unbelievable. I mean, the 2 brothers perpetrated the crime. It was a crime spree that took place on December 14th, which is why the release of the podcast on that date. But it's just a horrific crime, and the book itself is very graphic in nature.
Well, gosh, thanks again. Great story.
It's been a pleasure, Eric. Thanks so much for inviting me on your show.
Again, I have been speaking to Paul Caranci. He is the author of The Hanging and Redemption of John Gordon, the true story of Rhode Island's last execution. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Erik Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.